the third interview series of Undercurrent News podcast, and I'm very honored to be with Jason Drew, who founded AgriProtein, which is one of the major or early movers in the insect industry, and is now called Insect Technology. So thanks for joining me, Jason. And I just wanted to just get a little, I don't know where to start, but you've been one of the very early movers in the insect industry with an interesting project in South Africa. And now Insect Technology is looking for a more global expansion. I just wondered if you could give me a little sort of picture of where the company is at right now.
Well, we're started at the beginning. So it was more than a decade ago. Started out in the tractor shed of my farm in about 100 kilometers outside Cape Town, South Africa. And having moved to the farm, got very interested about food and food systems, started investigating food flows around the world, and ended up at a whole range of events, from waste sites in China to cow sheds in Saudi Arabia, the north, the Grand Banks of Canada, via the Sea of Galilee, and saw the devastating mess that is our world food chain, and indeed the state of some of our seas and our natural resources at the moment. Ended up at the back of a slaughterhouse, and there was a pile of waste going into an open pit in the ground, surrounded by flies. And I remember as a small kid, there's only two ways to catch a fish outside my grandparents' house in the north of England. One was a fly on the end of a line, the other was a maggot on the end of a hook. So quickly converted our tractor shed and set about 3 or 4 years of abject failure, failing to make flies grow in numbers, managing to kill them all fairly regularly. They're not really, at that point, having ever been a book on how to make flies survive or thrive. You can get 100 books on how to kill them. There's many PhDs written on how to kill flies with various insecticides, but nobody has really worked out or wanted to make flies live or survive. There are two periods when that wasn't true. One is in the mid-40s, during the height of World War II, when there were various projects around the world looking at fly larvae as a form of nutrition. That carried through after the war. But then, of course, we developed sonar, and fishing became catching, and the rest is history. And the other person who actually used flies quite extensively was, again, in a wartime setting, was Genghis Khan, who would never go into battle without flies. And he'd go into, as he conquered from Mongolia most of, as far as Vienna, I think, you'd never go into battle without flies in a covered wagon. And he'd take the larvae out, put them on the wounds of his soldiers. It's what we call today maggot debridement theory or treatment, where it is known that the larvae emit antimicrobial agents, and they consume broken cells but cannot eat whole cells. And so it cleaned out the wounds, and although Genghis Khan didn't know it, he was one of the first users of antibiotics, albeit natural rather than man-made. So I know far too much about flies and their history, and I could go on for hours, but I think you want to talk more about current applications and where we are.
Yeah, and I know as well that you've recently published a book on flies as well, The Story of the Fly. But does that also document the industry and its recent involvement and all of this?
Documents everything from Genghis Khan through Napoleon, who had an interesting flirt with flies, from the Triassic period when the first flies were found, right through to modern use of flies by the National Health Service, and of course their early adoption by NASA. Everyone thinks that the first animal to space was a pet or a monkey or a dog. In fact, it was a colony of flies. So they have a much more interesting past, and I think have a much more interesting future than anybody gives them credit for.
Right, that's great.
The Story of the Fly is really a collection of interesting anecdotes and stories about flies, right through to the modern evolution of the industry and where we see the industry going.
Right. That's great. No, I'm looking forward to reading that. We're very interested in the insect industry, and so are our readers. We notice that we get Undercurrent News gets very high readership on novel ingredients, especially the insect space. And we had a webinar recently where Cargill said that insects are possibly the most promising novel ingredient out there that could replace the traditional ingredients. Now I know, Jason, your company, previous company, AgriProtein, was one of the early movers in the insect space. And we've seen this incredible amount of venture capital entering companies in France, such as InnovaFeed, Protix, Insect with a Y. How about yourselves? Firstly, I'm curious to know what you think of this, this trend and the evolution of the industry, and secondly, your position in it.
So I think it's very clear that everything we do, and nowhere less so in agriculture, we need to close loops. We cannot continue to throw things away because there is no way. So we need to continue to close loops. The amount of waste that we put today into our landfills is dramatic, our organic waste. It's being increasingly banned because of the effect it has on the water tables over time, and in the short term, as the cells break down, it creates greenhouse gases. So there's a very big push towards making circular businesses, particularly in agriculture. There is no such thing as a way in nature, therefore we can't throw things away. We need to recycle, reuse, and do that wherever possible. So in this particular context, one of the challenges we face globally is where we get our complete proteins from to feed our monogastric animals, whether that's chicken, fish, pigs, and/or cats and dogs, and of course humans as well. So there's a need for complete protein, and most of that has traditionally come from our seas, pelagic fish. There is some very interesting new technologies, concentrated yeast. There is the single-cell bacteria, the type created by Callista and various other firms in that sector. So the single-cell bacteria is interesting as well. And I think that insects have an important role to play in closing that loop. Firstly, because they help us dispose and degenerate waste into something useful, which is compost, and at the same time produce something very much needed, which is complete proteins and oils. So that's why I see this industry of insect technology in its still very nascent early form as very key. There is a few certainties in life, one of which is our population is growing. The other is that that population, as it gets wealthier, wants to consume more and more complete protein and dairy, but complete protein in the form of fish, chicken, and those type of things in particular. And in order to fuel that demand and meet that demand, we need to find some alternatives rather than just using the food from the bottom of our pyramid, be it algae, plankton, and pelagic fish, right through to other sources of protein. So I think that insect and insect technology, whether that's of the mealworm type or the black soldier fly, has a role to play in helping us address these challenges that are with us now and will persist for decades to come.
Right. Well, where do you think that the industry is right now? We've seen that, very big venture capital inflows into a small number of European companies, and those companies seem to be at a stage where they're going from pilot phase to industrial scale. Do you think that we're at a stage where the insect meal could become an ingredient in animal feed? And I guess, for our audience, aquaculture is the interesting topic.
So I guess it's still got some way to go. So the industry has moved from small scale, where it has proved that insect meal is very beneficial in terms of food conversion ratio, in terms of growth, in terms of benefits in its inclusion in a range of fish feed products, be that from shrimp right through to salmon and salmonoids. So it has been tested and trialed in a range of feedstuffs. Some companies in France have already brought out their first fish to supermarket grown with a, albeit small, limited amount of inclusion rates of insect meal. It's gaining an consumer acceptability and traction, and indeed people beginning to ask for it, saying, is my farm fish genuine and sustainable? How much wild material has been used in its production? And so whilst that is very small, it's a leading light in that direction. The industry in general is polarizing around a number of smaller, larger players. because of the investment required to get from lab scale to trial industrial to full industrial scale. And the costs of those larger plants of doing that are in the tens of millions of dollars range, and therefore requires large amounts of investment. I think this coming year we will see, although there's been some fair interruption due to the coronavirus problems, the first larger scale factories coming online and beginning to produce. But I still think it is probably 5 or 6 years away before there is enough production by the industry in general to make a meaningful supply on a long-term basis to the fish and fish growing industries. Because even the large factories processing a couple of hundred tons a day of waste, producing 5, 10, 15 tons a day of waste, protein, is still very, very small compared to the overall market demand. And I think one of the challenges the industry faces is getting the scale of supply big enough to be able to meet the demand that is clearly there, not only from aquaculture, but also from the pet food industry. I think some of the other interesting things that are coming through are quite interesting as well. I mentioned earlier about Genghis Khan's use of larvae on wounds. So we know that larvae generate antimicrobial peptides. That's a natural thing that they do to kill the bacteria so that they can have the degrading cells themselves rather than leave them to bacteria. And that those antimicrobial properties feed through into the feed itself. So a young baby chick is fed larvae from a dung heap by its mother, and it attains an increased natural antibiotic resistance to the bacteria as they're around. That is moving into the fish world now. We're seeing some increasing trials that show not only functional benefits in terms of the food and the protein availability, food conversion ratios and everything else, but also some functional value in terms of the antimicrobial effect. So there's a lot to do still in research, there's a lot still to develop, but I think the key challenge for the industry is developing the scale at which it becomes a meaningful partner to the aquaculture industry.
Right, right. So I think there's a tendency out there that the industry looks at this as a fish meal replacement. But I think as you alluded to, there's a couple of recent studies that shows that there are definite health properties. And I think it's of primary interest for most of these industries to eliminate antibiotics from the supply chain. There's a huge pressure on the salmon industry here in Chile to do that. And do you think that there's a possibility that people will look at insects in a different way and think, well, this is not just a fish meal replacement, but actually there is a different kind of, that there's a health component to this as well that will possibly make it a different kind of, something that's different to fish meal and has a better, functional value?
I think that will come. There's certainly enough research. If you look at the whole global infrastructure, we've seen quite an enabling raft of legislation that's happened in Europe, and it's still continuing there. It's happened in the US and is continuing there. So the major marketplaces are beginning to accept and understand, and indeed facilitate the use and inclusion of fish meal into aquaculture feeds. That is going to be naturally followed in Asia, where this is happening quite quickly, and we have a lot of developments in Asia that are happening at the moment. And so as this industry gains traction, it is getting some push into the value-added side of and functional benefits of insect inclusion as a feed. But again, it still comes down to the basic issue that we need the volumes to be able to satisfy and become a partner to the aquaculture industry. And the insect industry is some way from that at the moment. Even with quite a few factories under construction around the world, we need dozens, if not hundreds, of these factories in order to be able to really begin to partner seriously with the aquaculture industry right across the world. And it will happen, and it's just a matter of timing, like everything else. And we'll see what happens with some of the other interesting technologies that are coming along, like the single-cell bacterial approach and those type of approaches as well, because they all have a role to play in meeting our, what I call the protein gap that I can see coming.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about what insect technology is up to right now, and maybe what the milestones are for 2021?
I guess we, like everybody else, are very focused on getting our factories out of the ground. Our partnership in North America with our site there is progressing very well. The building is complete. We're through the permitting stage there, and hopefully that will end up getting into construction, to the next stage of construction during this year, 2021. We have developed good partnerships in Asia and are exploring the markets in some detail there. We are looking to put a smaller scale, what we call a PDP, a pre-deployment plant, into place there, where we can test local foodstuffs, because the substrate or the material available in each country differs quite substantially by, in Asia there's far more oil in the cooking process, in Europe there's far less. So all those markets have a different approach. And we, like everyone else, are just desperate to get our factories built and out the ground, completing and supplying into the marketplace in some meaningful volume. And there are some producers, you mentioned the insect earlier, that are very much on the mealworm side. There's Protix very much on the BSF. There's some very good firms in North America that are producing BSF as well. And we need all of us to get on and succeed, and to get these factories out the ground, so that together we can begin to supply an alternative to, or become a valued partner to the aquaculture industry, wherever that might be in the world. There's still quite a long way to go, a lot of hiccups, as there always are along these roads, but I think the core basics now are in place. The technology works in lots of different places. The end material has been tested in terms of a protein, in lots of different feed inclusions, in ratios, and in different life stages, in different species, and all of that data is broadly available through university research. You can see the effects right around the world. So the challenge now is not to prove that the insect meal is a great addition to the aquaculture world, but to actually get the volumes produced that make it a viable partner for the industry.
Right, and I think one of the key topics is the feedstocks. Apologies for background noise. Somebody's decided to mow their lawn at the just as I'm doing an interview. That's but I think what we've seen, the likes of InnovaFeed have kind of locked onto agri waste streams, or perhaps derivatives of agricultural produce that have perhaps a better value. And we're just, I guess, what do you think the model is for insect technology? You said that the feedstock differs per country, but are you looking more at sort of the agricultural residues, or actual waste? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the early with AgriProtein in South Africa was actually having the insects feed off waste, if I'm not mistaken, human waste.
No, so the legislation depends on the country. So in Europe, you're not allowed to feed insects with anything that you cannot feed to other farmed animals, as it stands at the moment. That is changing and will change, because if you think about it in nature, an insect, a fly, might land on a cow dung in a field in Germany, lay its eggs, those become larvae, they go through the whole life cycle, become flies, they then fly over a stream, a trout jumps out, eats that fly, and is then caught by a fisher person, and it ends up on somebody's plate as an organic, natural fish. You haven't controlled the substances it was allowed to eat in that circumstance, yet everyone's very happy to have a wild trout. So Europe, because of its problems it faced under the BSE crisis, has a much more heavily regulated environment as to what insects can be fed. That is not the case in North America, nor is it the case in Asia, where a broader range of more genuine waste streams can be used and made available. So it's about proving the safety of those in Europe. That will happen in time. And the logical conclusion of the industry must be that in time, the larvae, the insects, are fed what we call genuine waste that has no real alternative use. It is what they have eaten for 100 million years. I know that because the first flies were found in amber from the Triassic period. And it hasn't affected flies during that period of time. During that period of time, endless birds have been eating those flies and not turned into leopards or dinosaurs on whose excrement the first flies fed. So the genetic pass-through is quite clear. It is really about the health standards and the production standards, making the end product to good GMP practice outcomes so that the protein is dependable, repeatable, its bioavailability is very clear, protein content's clear, amino acid profile is clear. And it's about getting that sustainability and repeatability into an industry, which is hard when it's very small and nascent. You can go along and buy, specific ingredients almost anywhere in the world and be very certain of their impact, of their use in the food chain, of their, in your food formulation, how they sit, what they cost and where they're at. And the insect industry needs to get that repeatability in so that it can really partner with the aquaculture industry.
Right. And I think, again, the consumer acceptance, I mean, obviously, using waste is the way for this industry to become, truly circular, like a circular economy concept. And I think as well that a lot of the consumer acceptance, or some studies have showed that actually consumers are quite happy to eat products with insect meal, but perhaps there's more question marks around the insects being the final product that that consumers eat. I just wondered what your take is on that, and maybe even what your product profile will look like in the future if you really are just focused on the kind of insect flour that will go into feeds, or whether you would focus on, direct human consumption.
So I think there's two very different markets. The market of end user human consumption, I think, will always be more limited. Yes, of course, cricket flour, cricket bars have taken off right across California. But I think that whilst probably a third of the population of the planet naturally eats insects in any case, they're very widely consumed across Africa and Asia. They're not as readily eaten in Western Europe and North America. Although, all of Europe and all of North America loves the insects of the sea, it's of course shrimp and lobster, but less keen on their land-based counterparts. I think that using them as a feed is a natural thing to do. If you talk to a general person in the public about what does a trout eat, so you can very quickly get them to understand that a trout jumps out of a stream in order to eat a fly. That's what they do. That's why fisher people around the world fish with flies on the end of the lines. So I think that sort of natural thing is quite well embedded to us. And I think that people not only accept that their fish will eat flies, but think it's natural and normal. And when those consumers are led on a journey of understanding that this closes a loop in agriculture, I think it will become not only acceptable, but probably demanded by those more environmentally concerned consumers. That's still some way out, and that's we all need to get more aware of where our food comes from, how it's made, and the costs of making it for the environment. But it will come. I just hope that these things accelerate and happen quickly.
Right. And I know that a lot of these early movers in the insect industry are focused on aquaculture and the prospect of growing aquaculture. Why is the aquaculture the most, is it the most lucrative or the best opportunity, as opposed to, say, for example, producing for the poultry industry or pork?
I think it's really that the aquaculture industry is probably the most scientifically advanced. It is a very advanced industry. People understand exactly the life stages, the food conversion ratio, the feed needs of those of the aquaculture species at various stages, and the end product is more valuable than chicken. Salmon and trout and shrimp is much more valuable than chicken, weight by weight. So therefore, the inputs have to be of a higher quality. The science has to be better. And that is why it's probably a primary market and a primary user for that. And I guess that's why the industry in general is targeting aquaculture. And I think it's very easy to explain to people why fish eat flies.
Right, right. Can you see it becoming a broader industry, though, as a feeding ingredient to all types of animal protein eventually? Do you think that's realistic?
I do, but as I pointed out earlier, we still need to get the volumes made before we can get into that discussion. But yes, if you look at pet feeds, I mean, insect protein is great for any monogastric animal. As I said earlier, whether it's fish or chicken or pet food, and of course humans. And we have to get. I mean, I always say that from where I stand, the future's broken, and we need to get busy repairing the future. This is one of the ways we can get busy repairing the future.
Yeah, that's a good comment. And just a lot of people from that. I'm sure that there'll be lots of people listening who are interested in investing in some of these companies, and there's lots of potential investors out there, I feel. And where do you think the industry is right now on the sort of operating cost curve? I imagine that nobody can produce insect flour, for example, at a commodity type cost that would compete with fish meal until we have these industrial scale facilities. But could you give me a little bit of a picture on where you think the OPEX will go with this industry?
Well, I think it's very clear that that the industry will follow almost every other large-scale farming operation. So, if you take a chicken in 1900, probably produced 3 or 4 eggs a week in the summer only. Now they produce 7 eggs a week, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for their lifespan. So the biology side will definitely improve as we understand how to improve our genetics through selective breeding in the fly bit. That will bring down our cost of egg generation. Then people will value waste more and more, say, increasing new cull throws away, so it has a disposal cost, and that will add to the production mathematics of this type of factory. And if you think about the first phones we made, mobile phones cost a fortune each to make. Now a mobile phone or basic one costs very little. The same will happen to factories and factory costs as they come down over time. So you can see all of that playing over the next 5 to 10 years into a useful cycle where the production costs will come down. The end price will always depend on supply and demand, and so nobody can really guess that. But what one can say is that production costs will come down. The cost of natural resources is unlikely to come down. So hopefully there'll be a meeting point at which this is more and more attractive for larger and larger scale investment into a great industry that can help prepare the future.
Right. And it was actually very interesting that there was the recent F3 conference where several of these companies spoke about the industry prospects. And one of the companies based in Asia said that they might actually, they're even now, they're getting close to a fish meal cost per ton, which I found quite surprising. And I think several other people did as well. Do you think that's realistic, that's already at that cost?
Yes, it's certainly heading in that direction very quickly. That doesn't mean that the market price will be there. The ability to produce at that price is great for the producer, but the demand is such that the price will not fall to anywhere near commodity for quite some time, because this is not, at the moment, a commodity play. There are plenty of niche marketplaces that will pay a premium price for this product and are likely to until such time as the industry grows in its production volumes enormously. But what is quite clear is that it is possible to produce at those prices. We've known that for some while, and that in time that will benefit everybody as the industry moves its costs down to that. And it's a competitive world with lots of different competing suppliers, and we will get to a point at which hopefully it will outcompete the natural resources or new use resources rather than recycled resources, because that's always the great thing. If you can buy recycled plastic pellets at the same price as new plastic pellets, why wouldn't you buy the recycled ones? Better for everybody.
Right. Right. No, that's interesting.
And you know, this is in another sense is nothing more than what we call nutrient recycling, just recycling waste nutrients and converting them back into a format in which they're usable again.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And just, I mean, I think now what we see is an industry that's a handful of producers around the world that are the front runners. Some of these have gone through Series A venture capital rounds, raised an incredible amount of money. There's a real buzz, you'll excuse the pun, around the industry with very celebrity investors. And if you look at the industry right now, I think there was even the first M&A deal where Insect with a Y bought another company in Europe. What do you think the industry will look like in about 5 years' time? Do you see there's already partnerships with big ag, but do you see a different industry in the sense that there might be bigger food groups owning these farming assets, or different types of operators in the industry?
I'm a great believer in learning from history, and at the moment there's a few very large integrated producers that do everything from procure their own waste, grow their own flies, produce their own eggs. Yeah, to take the example of the chicken industry, there's very specialist firms that make day-old chicks, that rear eggs, that produce 6-week-old point to lay. The same is true in the aquaculture industry of specialized breeding operations. And as the industry matures, I'm sure it'll split into more focused areas where people can really deliver the most added value to their sector. But I think that's still 5 or 10 years out, and what we need to see for the next 3 to 5 years, maybe even 7 years, is just focus on construction of plants and getting product into the marketplace and developing a positive relationship with the aquaculture industry, where insect meal becomes a valuable, understood and trusted supplier into the aquaculture industry.
That's great, and thanks very much for joining me for this conversation. And that was terrific. Thanks very much.